Welcome to another episode of Authors Recommend Books. I'm Bradley Verdell, and with me again today is Mark Will. Mark, what do you write?
As I've said before, I try my hand at everything. Poetry, prose, you name it. I do it.
Who would you say I know this could be a long list, but who would you say are some of the authors that maybe that inspired you the most, or that your work is similar to, kind of like if you like them, you might like me?
James Joyce, Marcel Proust, Leo Tolstoy.
Okay, good.
Those are probably my top three.
Awesome. And I'm Bradley Verdell. I write Victorian fantasy and steampunk books, kind of modeled after adventure stories from the time period that I'm writing in. So if you're a fan of H. Rider Haggard or Jules Verne or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, those are kind of some of my literary masters that I try to follow. All right, today we have a nonfiction and a fiction recommendation for you. We don't get any money for reviewing these books. These are just books that we've read and we like them, and we want to recommend them to you if you're looking for something to read. Especially if you've read my books or read Mark's books, then you'll probably enjoy our recommendations. Today I'm going to do a book that I enjoyed thoroughly, but I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about because it's about the Civil War. It's Hard Tack and Coffee by John Billings. Now, the reason I'm hesitant to talk about it is because there are so many people who know a million times more about the Civil War than I do. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not a Civil War buff. I don't know 100th of what I would like to know about that. You know, it is kind of in my time period that I like to focus on, but I'm not really deeply into the military aspect of things. I tend to like more the kind of daily life stuff, but that gets me on to the first reason that I like this book. So Hard Tack and Coffee is invaluable to me as a description of the actual day-to-day functional life of a soldier in the Civil War, in the Union. It's written by a Union soldier. And it doesn't mention, well, I mean, it mentions them in passing, but it doesn't go into battles, generalship, strategy, anything like that. It's more like you're just a guy, you've signed up for this war, and, what did you eat? What kind of tent are you sleeping in? What kind of personalities are you dealing with?
Let me guess, they ate hardtack.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And what did they drink?
Coffee?
No, tea. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, that's a interesting. I've read a couple of books about kind of the average life of a soldier going on, and I read one not long ago about the rations of British soldiers kind of throughout history and how it's evolved over time, and you can really see in more modern conflicts, whenever the U.S. is working hand in hand with the U.K., that's like the huge divide. Is like the fighting British man's drink of choice is tea, and the fighting American's drink of choice is coffee, and that's something that comes up even in like modern day conflicts where U.S. rations get sent to British troops, and they're like, what is this?
Yeah.
And things like that. Fantastic book if you're not into dates and battles and generals and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll just mention a few of the points that really struck me, I guess. One of the points was that he says, especially in the early days of the war, something that I think is kind of hard for modern people to imagine, which is that the people who signed up actually wanted to go and fight, and they wanted to win. And he talks about how, sometimes the people would sign up and before they were actually deployed, they're supposed to report in, they're supposed to be at camp, but maybe it's close to where their family lives, and they would kind of desert. But nobody really cared because it was like, well, they volunteered. They want to fight. They're going to come back. Like, yeah, they've sort of deserted, but by the time we move out, they'll be with us, So there was some kind of laxness about this. And one comment that he makes that really struck me was he talks about during the war how, of course, there were people who supported the South living in the North, and they had, their opinions, and there were people who supported the North living in the South and vice versa. And he says he feels like it was widely said in his time that the Southerner living in the North was much meaner about it and much more strident in their views. And he said that the reasoning for this was that the South hated Yankees, but the North only hated slavery. Because they didn't. It's like we didn't sign up to go kill Southerners because we hated Southerners, but we, because of religious reasons or whatever else, there was strong anti-slavery sentiments, and that's what they didn't like. They didn't bear any ill will to the enemy soldiers quite the way that maybe some of the Southerners felt about the North. Like they sort of really didn't like the Union, and the Union thought, well, we're going to preserve the Union. We just got to get rid of this practice. But that really struck me because you don't get sort of soldiers' opinions a lot. We tend to kind of look at history and kind of a broad thing. Okay, this war was fought over this and this and this, and here were the key people, and then it was over, and this happened,
Yeah.
And you don't really get like what it was, the sort of the texture of it. But he gives a lot of detail about their daily life. He talks about playing cribbage and euchre and checkers, and backgammon wasn't as popular and things like that. He talks about the sort of cast of characters that sort of every company had. There was always the guy who was skiving off, and there was the guy who swore all the time, and there was the new guy who brings all this extra gear that he's not going to be able to carry, and then on the first long hot march he's just throwing his gear away because he's brought too much stuff, and all these things that he thinks are a good idea. Another weird thing, he talks about people buying like a steel plate armor, and then that being kind of like seeming like a good idea, like if you've got, it was like $10 or something like that, so it's pretty significant investment, and then the new guy who buys this gets jeered at and laughed at by everybody, like, what are you wearing armor for, like you're just a coward or whatever, and then of course they would kind of shamefully take it off and not wear it. So there's a lot of interesting stuff like that. It details like in camp, to pass the time, people would dig up mountain laurel roots, carve pipes out of them, and things like that. It just really gives you that's the kind of history that I like. It's kind of like everyday life in very different circumstances than what we have today. Talks about making a slush lamp. You take a sardine box, you fill it with cooking grease, basically, use a rag, make a wick, and then if your ration of candles is run out, you can still have a light in your tent. It goes through, all the equipment, all the things that you would sort of normally expect to find in a book like this. And then, of course, because it's called Hardtack and Coffee, of course, the coffee keeps coming back. And what really shocked me, I guess, it's one of those things that I felt I should have known, but I guess, and maybe I did know it, but the book really does bring it out. He talks about the rations and how it was monotonous, and sometimes the food wasn't always fresh, or sometimes they didn't get what they were supposed to get, and there was corruption and officers getting the best and all this kind of stuff. But he said, everyone in the Union at least seemed to have only one opinion of the coffee, and that's that it was excellent. And it was perfect. He's like, well, sometimes we didn't get enough of it, or sometimes it didn't arrive on time, but what we got was fantastic. And then that he's not just sort of griping about everything. Because, then it's like, okay, when he says this really was terrible, it's kind of like, he's not just saying, oh, everything's terrible because being a soldier is terrible, and I don't like the rain, and I don't like the this. He's like, oh man, the coffee was amazing. And at one point, actually, apparently, and this kind of gets to the corruption aspect of it, you have people in the U.S. who want the Union to win slightly less than they want to make a profit. So he talks about this group of, like a startup, basically, a bunch of sort of, what's the term, speculators got together and bought up all the coffee, thinking they could sell it to the U.S. government at hugely inflated prices. And the government got wind of this, and they just got like an entire boatload from the U.K. Sent over, and they were like, no, you're not going to corner this market and all this stuff. And that's one of those things that is just like, oh man, how could you how could you choose money and how to make a buck more than supporting the soldiers in the war effort on your side or whatever. It's just kind of like, there's kind of like this horrible side of humanity that you see at certain points, and then there's a kind of but that's definitely in the minority of what you see. For the most part, you see a lot of surprisingly upright behavior from guys. So, like, for example, he talks about the idea that, like, sometimes a hospital would get captured, the medical tent or whatever, which were heated, by the way, which is really cool. I should just mention this. So they would dig like a trench under the medical tent, and the trench would be covered by like iron plates. You start a fire outside of the tent and let it sort of draw the heat and the smoke through it, and then come out like a flue on the other side of the tent, and boom, you have heated tents, which is pretty amazing little bit of Civil War era ingenuity. But it's like sometimes they couldn't actually take prisoners prisoner, and it makes it sound like what they did is they would just say, okay, give me your word of honor that you won't be a combatant again until you're properly traded for another prisoner. And people were like, okay. And honor, and for the most part, people honored that. For the most part, they played by the rules. And he says at one point in the book, something I thought about, you have this interesting circumstance in this war where the people who are fighting are from same language, same culture, same religion, more or less. And he says, don't skip over the fact that a lot of these people had been raised on the Ten Commandments and really believed it. So when he talks about harvesting, like basically, like stealing from the armies moving through, and hey, there's a farmhouse, let's take everything we can, for the troops. They really held their hands at the beginning. Now it got worse towards the end, right? And you get into like Sherman's march and stuff like that. And there were times when a family in the South, they never owned slaves. They had nothing to do with the South, or they weren't maybe even supportive of it. But they got every fence post taken down for firewood, all their animals taken, all their grain, everything, and they would just turned out like lost everything. But he says, especially in the beginning, people really felt it's wrong to steal. We shouldn't go shake down peasants for what we can get just because we're the opposing army. And he says something about, Sherman kind of had the idea that, the South should suffer for this, but that wasn't the sort of his and his company's view of things. So I just thought that was interesting. Many people today claim to find it impossible to believe anyone really believes in heaven and hell, but when you have somebody from this period telling you, we could have done a lot of bad stuff and gotten away with it, but we didn't because we were raised, even though this is wartime and things are rough, we know right and wrong, and we're not going to do it. So there's a lot of sort of hope for humanity in the book. One kind of final anecdote, and then I'll just kind of leave it at, because there's so much in this book. I could go on and on and on about all the things I thought were interesting in it, and it's definitely a book you could read 2 or 3 times and notice new things. But one story that I thought was kind of like brutal but understandable. You kind of gotten to know the life among Union soldiers is one more or less of fraternity and trying to make the best of a bad situation. They joke, they play around, they play practical jokes. There's a lot of songs and chants and things that they would do to kind of get through it, and you get this sense that, yeah, they really felt they were going off to fight for a good cause, and they, it was rougher than they thought it was going to be, but they tried to do their duty and they tried to do everything with honor or whatever. But there's a part where a guy has heard, well, basically they figure that one of the guys in their, I think it's company, it might be unit, but I think it's company. That's one of those things that I find difficult to keep straight, how many people are in a brigade and an army and a company. But it's a company, I think, is 100 guys. And they found one had been a traitor for the other side. They actually found like a secret message on it. So this guy's trying to give away their position or whatever. He's basically trying to help the South win, and he's a traitor in their midst. And even though they had eaten with this guy and joked with this guy and had a good time with this guy, normally traitors are hanged. But in this case, for whatever reason, they decided to give him what was perceived as a more honorable death, which is the firing squad, right? Normally, the man in charge decides who is going to be in the firing squad, and the troops don't really have a choice. Like, if you get called up, you're in the firing squad, whether you want to be or not. Yeah. The soldiers, all 100 people in this group, unanimously said, I want to be the one that shoots him. I want to do it. And of course they couldn't have a firing squad of 100 guys firing, but they chose 15 people. And normally, again, you have somebody else load the rifles and maybe mix them up or just pass them out so that not every rifle is loaded, so you can kind of have it off your conscience. Like, maybe my rifle's empty, I'm just following orders, Right. Nobody knows who. Well, they let the men load their own rifles, or muskets, I should say, I guess. And the inspection of the body revealed that it did have 15 bullets in it. So every single guy had loaded to shoot this traitor. Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. And I guess, that just was, that was an anecdote that hung with me. The last thing I want to say is it's an incredibly funny book, an incredibly witty book, and incredibly well written. And it never ceases to amaze me how, we have all this information at our fingertips in the modern day, and almost everybody, well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, they say, if you have a university degree, probably all your friends do. Kind of like if you smoke, you're probably friends with smokers. If you don't smoke, you probably don't know that many smokers, Mm-hmm. I think, a lot of people in my generation, we've all been to university. Maybe we got a useful degree, maybe we got a useless degree, but everybody's got a degree kind of thing, And we all think we're very smart, but when you read something from this long ago, where education is much more scarce, and see somebody write this eloquently and with this much wit, it challenges the notion that we're getting smarter, I would say. He has a chapter about mules, the army mules that carried equipment and stuff. And it's probably among the funniest things I've ever read in a historical work. It's absolutely laugh out loud hilarious. I mean, he talks about how frustrating mules are and how uncertain they are, and he gives them kind of like little personalities, they're like a trickster, sort of, and he talks about a mule, crossing a pontoon bridge, but you can't trust them even when they're acting perfectly. You never know when they're just going to freak out for no reason. He says, the mule looked in the water, and for the first time, he must have seen himself the way he really was, and then decided to go nuts and lose all the kitchen equipment in the river, and throw the cook in the river and all this stuff. He talks about how people who were fervently against swearing just became the worst violators if they were put in charge of mules. He says, not everyone who swears works with mules, but everyone who works with mules swears. And there's a really hilarious bit where he talks about, it was often said that if we could just creep up to within earshot of the front line, and get every mule driver in the Union to stand up and just curse to their really just unleash a flood, a torrent of their most vicious swearing. The South would just lay down their arms and give up immediately. They would be so bowled over by the talk of these mule drivers. So it's really funny, and it manages to treat for someone who was actually fighting in this war, it's surprisingly lighthearted and surprisingly. Well, I wouldn't say surprisingly. I think that is what you would expect. I think you go to a source like this expecting to see the texture that history brushes over. There's a lot of nuance in it that you don't really get from casual conversation about the Civil War. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly of both sides, and there's all the full range of humanity kind of expressed, from like really dark and tragic to amazingly bright and hopeful, and kind of everything in between. So it's an absolutely fantastic book. I think anyone who's interested in the Civil War has probably already read it, because I think it's one of the first go-to books. I know for Civil War reenactors, this is a major source for like
right? Mm-hmm.
How to camp, what they ate, how they made different things and stuff like that. So they probably already read it, but for the general reader, I would say, if you're not going to read anything else, if you're only going to read one book about the Civil War, I would highly suggest this one, because I think it's more surprising than the sort of high school history book version of this battle and this battle, right, and these forces got turned back. There's none of that. It's very human and yeah.
What exactly is hardtack?
Yeah, hardtack is I've actually, well, I shouldn't say I've made it. My significant other has made it, and I've gotten to, there are different recipes online, but it's basically just flour and water, and it's a really hard cracker-like bread, kind of like, basically like Naval Biscuits, ship's biscuit. In fact, that's when he talks about, sometimes they could get soft bread, but he said, men who had followed the sea always preferred hardtack anyway. But it's so hard. It's even if you put the corner in your molars and try to break it off, sometimes you can't. I mean, it's so hard. If it's made very thick, you can actually like put this square of giant hard cracker and break it with a hammer into pieces. A lot of he goes through all the different ways that they ate it. They would put different things on it, and you could use it to thicken soups and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Some people crumbled it as finely as they could and put it in their coffee. They did a million different things to try to dress it up and make it interesting. But I mean, it's one of those things that you come across in this time period. Any book about sailing is gonna have this. It's just kind of one of the original rations. It's like, how do you serve out food for an army? How do you make enough? I've read a book about the baking and distribution of the stuff, which I'll cover it at one point, and that's actually from the UK's perspective. Is talking about the British Navy, but you could spend your entire life studying the distribution of hardtack through the ages. But I think it's what Tolkien had in mind, if I'm not mistaken, when he talks about the dwarves' cram, which the elves have the limbus bread, which is like the very nice traveling bread, but dwarves have something like cram, which is sort of like hardtack. It's like I might have gotten that wrong, but at least that's what I associate it with. I'm pretty sure that's what he had in mind. But yeah. What do you got for us today in the fiction department?
Well, in the last couple of episodes, I talked about my trip to Europe.
That's right.
Last summer.
You got more pictures for us?
Do you remember our hashtag?
Hashtag?
The Grand Tour.
I remember you said it was the Grand Tour of Europe, and you've been to the cultural centers of Europe. Which are what, 7 or 8 different cities?
Yeah. So we've covered Berlin and Prague.
So
and today we will be talking about Vienna.
Vienna.
That was the next stop on the itinerary. And so in Vienna, I went in search of canonical author Thomas Bernhard.
Okay.
He's a writer that I discovered within the last 10 years, I would say, and he's become a literary master. He was based in Vienna, and all the books of his that I've read are set in Vienna and have something to do with the city.
Is that where he grew up, or just where he ended up?
No. He was actually born. I want to say that he was born in the Netherlands, but he's basically an Austrian. I mean, he spent his formative years there, and lived and died there. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I should note that I mention, or Bernhard is mentioned in my forthcoming novelette, Flansday.
Oh, okay.
By the time, just in passing, but by the time this episode is aired, Flansday will probably be available on Amazon.
Wait, pitch Flansday. I want to hear it. I've read bits and pieces of it in the writer's group.
Do I want to do that now? Flansday is the first novelette in a series called Aranesque, and it's about two American writers who...
not us, though.
No, not us. Who travel to Ireland to celebrate James Joyce during the Bloomsday, the annual Bloomsday festivities. And they also celebrate other Irish authors, including Flann O'Brien, and so that's the background of Flansday. But anyway, Thomas Bernhard is mentioned in passing by one of the characters. I should say that Bernhard is famous, or perhaps infamous, in Austria. He was highly critical of everything. I mean, he was something of a misanthrope, but he had very critical things to say about Austrian culture and art and so on. And so great was his disdain for his country and his countrymen that in his will he denied, or he how can I put it, he refused to allow his plays. He was primarily a playwright, though he's probably known in the States more for his novels, but he refused to allow his plays to be performed in Austria.
Wow!
Like
wow,
they could
what
be
a middle finger!
Yeah, they could be performed elsewhere, but not in Austria.
Not exactly Julius Caesar's will, that one.
Yeah. So anyway, in Vienna is the House Wittgenstein. The philosopher Wittgenstein became interested in architecture, and he obsessed over the design of this house, which I think was he was building it for his sister, I think. And he was never satisfied with it. He kept wanting to add to it. He kept wanting to change things, and so it was just
it sounds like every novel that I'm writing. Yeah.
That's right. And so this becomes a sort of metaphor for the process of artistic creation. And so he fictionalizes Wittgenstein's obsessive building of House Wittgenstein in the novel Correction, which is also fantastic. He imagines this character based on Wittgenstein building a structure out in the forest called the Cone, but the original inspiration for the Cone is House Wittgenstein, which is in downtown Vienna, and I went there, I saw it, It was amazing. I didn't get to go in because when we were there it was closed, but I spent an hour, wandering around taking photos, and I'll probably be able to send you a photo that we can put here. So that was an important part of the Austrian trip, or the trip to Vienna for me. But also, and my focus today is this novel. It's called Old Masters. And you see on the cover, Tintoretto's White Bearded Man. This painting is at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, the art history museum in Vienna. And it's actually there. I saw it. I took a picture of that too. And it is the I guess the inspiration for this novel. So Old Masters there are really only two characters. There's Rhaegar, and then the narrator of the novel is Atzbacher, who considers Rhaegar his imaginary father. Now, Rhaegar is obsessed with this painting. Every day that the museum is open at the same time, I think it's 11 a.m., he goes to look at this particular painting, and he contemplates it for like an hour.
Wow.
And he has all of these thoughts about art and painting and culture and literature that he shares with his friend, the narrator. And so that's really what this book is about. It's their friendship, and then the discussions that they have as reported by Atzbacher.
Interesting premise.
Yeah. And so his Rhaegar, like Bernhard, is something of a misanthrope, but he's also, like Bernhard, very interested in all of the arts. And just as Correction, focused on architecture, and some of Bernhard's other novels focus on drama, the theater, literature, and so on. Obviously, the focus of Old Masters is painting and the visual arts. So Rhaegar dismissively, sarcastically refers to the old masters, and he says things like, artists are the worst liars. He says, no, all artists, even if they are the most important ones, and as it were the greatest, are nothing except kitschy and embarrassing and ridiculous. He says, not one of these world-famous masterpieces, no matter by whom, is in fact whole or perfect. But he also says, art is the most sublime and the most revolting thing simultaneously. So this ambivalence towards the productions of culture, I guess you could say, artistic creation, is emphasized not only in Old Masters, but really in all of Bernhard's work. So art is important, but at the same time, it's garbage. That seems to be his premise. It's certainly the view of the Rhaegar in the character in Old Masters.
Well, you mentioned that he was a critic of culture, the culture at large, right? And now he's sort of criticizing the producers of culture. What's the issue, do you think? Like, what's the connection between, these old painters and what he didn't like about, popular culture in his time?
Well, I mean, he would probably argue that they are the result of the same impetus, whether high or low culture. There's something sublime and something revolting about every cultural production. But despite this ambivalence, he says, of course he immediately contradicts himself and then and then reverts back to this idea and contradicts himself again, in their dialogue. But he also says, I have to go to the old masters to be able to continue to exist. Mm-hmm. So however ambivalent he may feel about it, however disgusted with the artist's productions, and himself for, being interested and spending so much time contemplating these works, he must do it. I mean, it's like a religious dedication. Every day the museum is open. Every day the art history museum is open. He goes there and sits in front of that painting. So when I was there, it was amazing, because it was like I had become a character in the novel, and I'm just sitting there looking at this painting and thinking, what was it about this that he found so fascinating? I mean, I saw other paintings that were more interesting to me, but I tried to put myself in his position and consider his mindset and see what was it that. But the longer you look at it, the more you can be pulled in by it.
That's right. Yeah, there's something about paintings. Like, I'm not an art guy. I don't really know anything about art. I mean, I've been to some important museums and had a good time, but like, I was in the Hong Kong Maritime Museum not long ago, and they have some like oil paintings of ships, and there's a lot of paintings of ships, and I love ships, don't get me wrong, but there's always, whenever I go to an art gallery or museum or something, which is not often, so again, I'm not talking like an expert here, but there's always one that stands out to me as more interesting than everything else, and because you're. Yeah, maybe you can pull up a picture of it online, but there's something about thinking, wow, what if this were the only place I could see it? And the only time, And, there was this one painting there that I looked at for probably like 4 or 5 minutes because I wanted to get the details in my brain. So I thought, wow, this is really enjoyable. I should just look at this for a minute. And then others I just kind of walk by and don't do anything for me.
Well, it's definitely a different experience when you're actually in the presence of the work of art. Like seeing it on this cover, seeing it online, even looking at a photograph that I took of the painting after the fact, that's nothing compared to, or let's just say it's different from the experience of actually being there in its presence.
Like, wow, like the brush of a famous artist actually touched that canvas. Like, that's the one. That's the canvas.
Yeah. That's right. Anyway, to get back to the book, Rager's conclusion is, art altogether is nothing but a survival skill. So, whether he loves it, hates it, he needs it. It's. I mean, I feel that way about.
I was just going to ask you that.
It's something I have to do. Sometimes I hate it and feel frustrated. Sometimes I feel ecstatic and it's glorious. But love it or hate it, it's just something that I need to do. It is a kind of survival skill. I quite agree with that.
It just happens like that. For me, it's like I can't not write, and that's been true from a very young age. Like from a very young age, and anytime I've gone through a period where I didn't write, which are few and far between, I'm thinking of the thing that I want to write.
That you will write when you have the opportunity.
Yeah, and if you even think, that's a cool idea, but I'm not going to write it, and I'm not going to make it into a book, that idea just eats away at me until I have to write
something
it down.
with it.
Yeah, especially like going on long hikes. Like when I was living in Tennessee, I would go on these like really long hikes. And sometimes by myself, if you're just like hiking through the woods for like 20 miles, my brain is just turning. Oh yeah, I should put this idea in. I should put this idea in this. And I should write this down before I forget it. And then.
And do you have a notepad with you on the hike?
No,
or your phone, or
no.
You just remember.
Yeah, it just that's my mind just defaults to thinking about plots. And stuff.
Yeah. See, I have
to. What it is.
I have to record it somehow, either in a notebook or on my phone or just something. Email myself so I don't forget. I need to have some kind of documentation of it. Otherwise, the ideas are too fleeting. I'll forget them. I mean, not always. Sometimes an idea really, takes root, and you can't forget it. But a lot of times, good ideas are very fleeting, and if you don't record them in some way, they're gone.
Yeah, that's true for me for very specific things. Like I think of this is a good little conversation to have. Sometimes it's just 2 or 3 lines.
Well, yeah,
write it down.
But those are often the most important.
Yeah, it's the
devil
really
is
good
in the
details.
details.
That's right.
Okay, I'll just wrap up by reading a few more passages because they're so funny. So, in addition to his musings on art and artists, as I said, Rager, this character, is something of a misanthrope. Here's a funny observation. We hate people, and yet we want to be with them because only with people and among people do we stand a chance of carrying on without going insane. This is very much this is a typical Bernhardian view.
Okay.
It's like it's love-hate with everything, whether it's people, art, whatever.
Yeah.
About educators, he says, the teachers are the henchmen of the state.
I think I'm 110% behind that one.
Yeah. On politicians. The politicians are the murderers, indeed the mass murderers of every country and of every state.
Well, that's literally true. I mean,
Yeah. And on writers, there are no greater or worse liars than those who write. The world, as long as it exists, has not known any greater liars than those who write.
Yeah. That reminds me of Rudyard Kipling talks about that, you had to be good at lying because he was I'm pretty sure this was Rudyard Kipling, unless my brain has just gone totally haywire. But it was when family was in India, sent to live with someone else in England, and they just were brutal to him, really abused, as a child. So he had to kind of lie and sneak around and stuff. He's like, I got really good at lying,
And that was useful in his trade.
Yeah, it's very useful.
Yeah. Okay, so to close, I would just like to recommend some other books by Bernhard. The Loser. This one is about music, actually, and it's based on the Canadian pianist Glenn Gould, who studied. I think he actually studied with Bernhard, and so one of the characters in The Loser is based on Glenn Gould. Now, Glenn Gould, or the character based on Glenn Gould, is the successful pianist. The loser is a classmate of the Glenn Gould character that just is not at his level, and his whole life is ruined by that fact. He just sees himself as inferior to the Glenn Gould character, and he eventually, I think he hangs himself. There's almost always a suicide in a Bernhard novel. But
okay.
So that's if you read The Loser, you'll see his thoughts about music primarily. Woodcutters. That's a great meditation on the theater and drama, and actually I should point out the theater, I can't remember the name of it, one of the national theaters in Vienna, where a performance takes place in the novel. I went there too, so that was exciting. Wittgenstein's nephew is somewhat autobiographical. I mentioned Bernhard was obsessed with Wittgenstein. He actually knew Wittgenstein's nephew and became friends with him when they were convalescing. So they weren't
contemporaries, but they were he was a little bit younger?
I think, Bernhard's a little bit younger. He may have met him, though. I mean, their lives would have overlapped.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm not sure if they met, but he was friends with Wittgenstein's nephew, and because they were convalescing in a sanitarium, I think Bernhard had TB or something, or maybe the nephew did, but anyway, they were both sick, and so they developed a friendship in this sanitarium, and that's what the autobiographical novel is about. And then, of course, Correction, which deals with architecture and, the cone, this building that the main character obsesses over, is based
that one
on
sounds
House
really interesting to me.
Wittgenstein. It's great because the idea of correction is when we create, and it's true of writers as well, we're always correcting. It's never perfect. We can always make it better. And so he implies, he even says something to this effect towards the end, but like every artistic creation is a correction of a correction of a correction of a correction ad infinitum. It's an endless process, and this is what creates that obsessive compulsive fixation and often drives Bernhardian protagonists insane and to suicide, because they can never achieve, whether they're writers, actors, artists, any kind of creator, they're never able to achieve their goal. They're never able to adequately express what they're trying to express. So in a way, like culture, I think this is, maybe it occurs to me now as I'm talking about this, maybe this is what Bernhard is getting at when he expresses this ambivalence. All culture, all artistic expression is in some ways a record of failure, because you never achieve perfectly what you want to achieve, and this is the source of this is the source of the frustration. So anyway, if those sorts of thoughts and obsessions interest you, you will
this book will make it worse.
This book will make it worse, but you'll also love it. You will come to hate Bernhard as I do. He's really a late 20th century master, and I'm, as a completionist, I'm still making my way through his novels, but
you say you just discovered him like 10 years ago. So.
Yeah, and I've been reading other people as well, but I will eventually make my way through all of his works that are available in English, because he's always entertaining and interesting.
Good stuff. All right, well, hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, give us a like. We went a little bit longer this time, but that's fine. Sometimes, I don't know. It just happens. In fact, well, no, I'll mention it in a minute. But yeah, I mean, I found that very interesting. If you like the video, give us a like. If you think our longer videos are better or shorter videos are better, or you have any comments about the channel, please drop a comment below. You can find Mark's books and Mark's music and where to follow him on social media down in the description. Hopefully you already know where to find me, and that's how you found this channel. But if you don't know who I am, or you want to read my books, the links are in the description. And as always, just a reminder that Amazon reviews are the lifeblood of us self-published authors. So please review our books if you've read them, and consider subscribing to the channel. Share this video with all your friends and all your enemies.